Okay, right. Welcome to today's session on clinical and non-clinical cases, how to teach them well. So, and I would like to welcome Claire Beswick again from the Business School Case Study Unit. And I'll hand over to her now. Just before I hand over, is today's sort of going to be a collaborative session where we're basically going to approach it workshop style to find out how to teach the clinical and non-clinical case as well. Welcome, Claire.
Thanks, Janus, and hello, everybody. Yes, the idea that we had was to break us up into two groups shortly. And Janus, you might have to remind me exactly of the timings. And in the first session, we'd be talking about the characteristics of clinical and management cases, good clinical and management cases. I think the idea is that we recognized from our discussion last week that there are two different kinds of cases that you're using in your context. There's the clinical and sort of bedside environment, and then there's the non-clinical or management cases that, there may be some commonality, and in fact, we may be able to learn from each other, and those of us who use them in the different contexts, from the different kinds of cases, but to think of them as different entities and understand each of them in their own merits, and to do that in two separate groups, particularly, and then to come back together again, and then in the second half to break away and to talk about ideas for teaching them effectively. Is that right, Janice? Please just correct me if I've got my ideas all turned upside down.
Yes, Claire, that's exactly correct. So I just shared the document in the chat with you.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
if you go onto the document, you'll see group 1, group 2, group 3. So at the last breakaway session, we'll have 3 groups, one which is focused around clinical case teaching, the second group being around like case teaching or business cases, and the last group being, so large face-to-face, clinical bedside, and online blended learning. So those are the 3 groups. In the first session, you'll only join group 1 or group 2. So the first breakaway session is group 1, is what is important for good clinical teaching, and there's some questions guiding that discussion there. And group 2 is around what is important for good business case teaching, or case teaching. Doesn't necessarily have to be business cases, but other type of case teaching. And so we have got group 1 there and group 2 there that you can work on. So we will, the breakaway groups would be 15 minutes. So you have 15 minutes to discuss in either group 1 or group 2, whichever you feel, which group you want to join. And after that, we'll come back and we'll consolidate and have a discussion around what you've discussed. And then from there on, we'll do the second breakaway, which is around, as Claire mentioned, which is around coming up with innovative approaches and so forth for the different types of case teaching. Okay, right. I will give you so I'll join the different groups just to make sure that I can post in the chat how much time you have left or when you have to return. But if we could possibly, let me just look at my oh, you didn't, sorry, I just realized I didn't show the document.
I think you did earlier, just now, didn't you?
Did it? Okay,
Yeah.
so you did see the
Sure.
document.
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. Then, okay, so the timing is 7 past. So if we can, if we come back, so what's 15 minutes plus 7? So it's 20. 22 past.
Yes.
So if we could come back to the main room at 22 past. But I'll also send a reminder in the different groups.
And how are we going to go into the different groups? Are you going to assign us, or how does that work?
No, so all you need to do is click on so if you go onto the document, there is a link group 1, group 2, group 3. So you just need to click on that, but I'll also post it or let me just post it one by one. That might be a bit better. Copy. So this is group 1. I'll only post the 2 for now.
And what is group 1 going to be? Remind us again. Sorry, I'm feeling.
So group 1 is going to be what is important for good clinical case teaching? And there's the questions. And group 2, what is important for good business case teaching? And people can answer in the spaces here in group 1 or group 2. I think everyone has access to, everyone can edit. So you can just click on the link and in your groups, add your comments to the different groups.
Good. Okay.
Right.
I'm off to group 2 then.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, I think our group is all back now.
Yes, I think everyone's back now.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know, group 1, would you like to give us feedback first about what was your findings? Anyone from group 1? Okay, let's start with group 2. So what was the findings in your group?
Stephen, do you want to present because you took the notes?
Sure. So we only got through 2 of the 4 questions, which I think is understandable. But we redefined this idea of a business case study, and to say that it relates to things like organizational management teaching. And the reasons why we thought it was important is that it allows for authenticity in real life settings and the application of critical thinking. And for students to apply what they've learned to existing or real life situations, but especially in a way that is safe and that's not going to have, an actual impact in the real world. And it allows for students to practice critical thinking. It's an opportunity for solving real world problems. And it allows for situations that are not all black and white, the way there's nuances and complexities, and students have to think and make choices. And it prepares them well for those real world settings. Students are able to discern what's important, should be able to discern what's important and what's not, as it's making those decisions and testing their decision-making abilities, and what should be prioritized. It showcases learning of successful stories too. So it's not just about identifying problems, by showing where things have gone right and why they worked. And it makes it easier for collaboration and teamwork, because students will be expected to discuss and work together. Giannis, to stop me if I'm going on, we didn't talk about the characteristics, but some of those characteristics are in what I've just described. I think we're not quite sure how we would teach this well. We didn't have that discussion. I think that's a longer discussion, but we did say that what we think is important for student learning is that students review and have an understanding of the teacher or lecturer's role. And it's not just about giving out questions, but it's also about feedback and engagement. And we should be tapping into all the 21st century skills in doing this. Students need to read the case, so the case has to be accessible and readable to those students, and they should want to read it. They should be excited by it, and that allows us to, students to take ownership, I think, of the process. yeah, that's me.
Cool, thanks, Stephen. And okay, Mervyn, how does what so for your group in terms of how, or anyone from group 1 in terms of what group 2 found, how is it similar and different? Clinical cases.
I think for us, the most important thing, and Sabir made the point, and it's absolutely critical, is that we're trying to help the students translate their theoretical knowledge into practical application. And so with regard question 1, if you wouldn't mind just showing me the questions, I'll go through them quickly.
Okay.
With regard question 1, I've made those comments. To be able to take an appropriate history, the purpose of a clinical case teaching is to be able to take an appropriate history to elucidate pertinent symptoms, because a patient presents with symptoms, and then to be able to examine the patient comprehensively to seek appropriate signs that would support the symptoms and lead to a diagnosis. And there's Sabir's absolutely crucial point that we've got to bring practicality to theory. What would the characteristics be for a good clinical case? And that would depend very much on whether it's a bedside situation or a clinical discussion. Because in the bedside situation, one's approach must be very different in terms of elucidating the symptoms and demonstrating the signs so that they can actually see what things mean. How do you teach this well? And as far as we are concerned, we've got to reinforce the students' understanding of the basic sciences so that they can understand what is right, so that they can recognize what has gone wrong. And then what are the important considerations for student learning? And again, it would depend whether this is a clinical situation or it is a discussion group. And in the clinical situation, the most important considerations are getting them to now solidify the anatomy, the physiology, and the pathology into a continuum so that they understand this. And the interaction that Stephen was making about the students being involved in this kind of interaction is very important. But the interaction is very different from the bedside to the discussion group. I don't know if that makes a contribution. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. It definitely does. The one thing that that you mentioned made me think about the I don't know, I lost my train of thought what I wanted to say. Sorry, I guess it'll come back to me now. But the other thing I was thinking about is my question to you would be, is the students ever introduced to learning with cases in terms of how they should approach case-based learning? And that's to both groups.
From day one.
From day
one, whether it's a clinical or a discussion group, from day one, we emphasize how important it is to take a logical history systematically and how important it is to thoroughly examine the patient. So because they've got a heart condition, for argument's sake, doesn't mean to say you only examine the heart. You've got to take the blood pressure, you've got to look for edema, you've got to look for eye changes. So it's a comprehensive thing. And from day one, we encourage the students to think about the patient, not the problem. This is a patient, who has a problem, but we're treating the whole patient, not just the problem. So it's not a matter of just fixing what's wrong, it's fixing the person who has a problem. And I'm sure I speak for my colleagues when I say we have to look at this holistically. Thank you.
Thanks. My other question, yeah, the thought just got back to me while you were speaking. My other question would be, so you said reinforce the basic sciences and so forth. When you present, so when cases are presented, do you bring in theory questions as well alongside the cases?
Absolutely, always. From my point of view, I always start off and I encourage my students when they're studying and when we're in groups to start off with the basic understanding of anatomy and physiology. And then as they grow, then they start to appreciate, but what would happen if? And we put in hypothetical considerations, more so in the discussion group than in the clinical environment, because obviously it can be quite distressing for a patient to hear all this academic discussion, and then they pick up words and they misconstrue. So one has to be quite guarded in terms of one's language in a clinical environment, as opposed to in a discussion group. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And then my question to group 2 is, do you introduce your students to the case study method and how to use cases effectively as part of being able to, it's a paradigm for the student, so it's something that they are not so familiar with. So is it scaffolded? And do you introduce them to the to how to learn with cases?
At the business school, I tell you, I don't think we do. I think that you just dump them in the deep end, and there might be something written in one of the course packs on what to do, but basically dump them in the deep end, read the case, come to class, and the faculty member guides you through it. But I think that's to the detriment of being able to use the case or learn with the case effectively.
Thanks. And Stephen?
I have nothing else to add there, Jonas.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I think then yes.
Yes, it's Pearl. In our group, Sakani had a bit on how they are using case studies. So maybe she could elaborate further on your question, not to throw her on the deep end.
Okay. Do you have anything else to add? So I actually did know the answer to this, but I just wanted to say what heard.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I was muted. It's Chakani. What we have done with our students, we do it over, because it's a 3-year program. We do it over 2 years. So when they're doing their BOHSC second year, we explain to them what the case study, what's the purpose, what they need to do. So we have a book that has cases, and we take them through so that they can learn how they work, how they can, do everything, and how they can apply that information in the clinical area, and how to combine the theoretical and the clinical component of things. And when they go to their 3rd year, we say we change roles. We're not the ones who give them cases, but they have their own cases, and they develop their own cases, and they actually present it to everyone in the department, and it carries it counts towards their year mark. It contributes to their year mark. So in 3rd year, they would have 2 case studies that contribute to their year mark that they have developed on their own, and they use it for their learning. That's what we do.
Okay, great. I think that's an awesome approach, like especially allowing students to contribute case studies to the environment. So in HSS1, we actually do introduce case-based learning to students through a series of YouTube videos that was created by Oslo Business School. But we actually haven't spent a session to actively take students through it. We just refer them to the resource, but we haven't done it because there's no time to include that as well, which I guess is a bit of a failing, because I think it's quite important for them to think, well, to understand how to use the case study approach, as it's a different way of learning, and to outline the expectations clearly. Okay, so
just before we move on, sorry, Janus, Michelle had her hand up earlier, and I don't know if she had a chance to say what she wanted to say.
Oh, sorry, no, I didn't see that.
No, I didn't. Thanks. Sorry. I joined late. I only joined at about 4:15. So I listened to some of the group 1 discussion. So just bear with me if some of my comments are inappropriate. So from a clinical, from the medical clinical side, because I realize that this is a mixed platform, I think, of business plus whatever. And I would stand with Mervyn that those of us who trained long ago, and I really don't think it should be any different today, the main focus in the clinical years is bedside or case-based teaching. There is, to me, there is no other way to do it. Of course, it's got to be supplemented with the theory, etc., etc. So I would, and the cases are there. There's no shortage of patients in our environment, and any case lends itself to teaching from various aspects. So for what I would add to that clinical, the group 1, apart from the assessment or the symptoms and signs, is to say they need to learn investigation and interpret appropriate investigation, interpret results, which they can't do. I'm talking about our students, and also management. And then what was highlighted for me today is our students are, I don't know if it's an English problem, they are unable, when you say in a baby or a child, to work out mils per kilogram per day if you want to give IV fluids or if you feed them. And similarly, if you ask them what dosage of drug would you prescribe, and of course PEDS is always weight-based, it's not like an adult. So if you ask them how many milligrams are per, and the child is whatever weight and the recommended dose is 20 milligrams per kilogram, how would you do it? And I think the problem with our guys, which just shows you how basically we have to go in a very limited time, is they don't actually, in the English, I don't think they understand what per mil or per day or per kilogram. And it's just going absolute basics. So how we do it in this allotted time, but I don't know if any other way of doing it other than bedside/case-based teaching. Thank you.
Cool, thanks for that, Michelle. Okay, so from that, I think let's go. We don't have a lot of time, so let's just spend 10 minutes on the next question, which is, so you can either choose group 1, group 2, or group 3. So group 1 being, what innovative approaches can you use for teaching cases in large face-to-face classrooms? And how would you create an environment for case teaching? So that's group 1. Group 2 is basically the same, but for clinical and bedside settings. And group 3 is online blended learning. So if you could decide which group you would like to go to, and then just click on the links, I'll add so for group 1 and 2, it's the same link. For group 3, which is blended and online, I will just add the additional link on the chat, and yeah, then you can choose your group, and let's be back at 52 past or 53 past. That gives us a few minutes to consolidate. But also while I quickly share my screen. So the one thing I also wanted to say around innovative ways is I've been looking at a few approaches, and I think if one can change so like the discussion we had for the HSS1 case around multiple artifacts, like using a newspaper article to be included, or if you could use multimedia as well, especially in the online space where you could have a video case or one of the things in terms of the simulated cases, but I'll speak to that once I got feedback, where you could actually have role players to sort of act things out and so forth to make it more interesting. But yeah, let's get feedback. I see everyone's back now. So there was nobody in group 1, so nobody was interested in how to teach cases in large classrooms. So group 2, I don't know if you would like to go first with giving feedback.
Well, it was just Michelle and I, and we were talking about the clinical environment, and basically there's no substitute for the clinical environment. However much one wants to invoke multimedia and other sources of teaching, the clinical environment remains unique. And even though you watch videos and listen to sounds on a screen, playing beautiful sounds of whatever, there's nothing that quite takes the place of a stethoscope on a chest to listen to the example that we discussed was a pleural effusion. And until you have done it, until you've heard it, you cannot recognize it, because what you hear on the videos is exaggerated. It doesn't reflect accurately a true clinical situation. It gives you an idea, but to have that stethoscope plugged into your ears and attached to the patient's chest is the right way to learn, or your hands on an abdomen, or whatever the case may be, or feeding a fontanelle, just to quote one of Michelle's examples. You cannot in any way replace actual clinical experience with other forms of blended learning. Yes, you can introduce an academic understanding, but the clinical experience is the teacher. I can talk to you about playing the piano and explain to you in great detail how you have to use your hands and exercise your fingers. But until you put your hands on a keyboard, you can't do it. And the same applies in medicine. Thanks.
Thanks. Feedback from the blended online group. What was your findings?
So we said that it's helpful to have materials designed smartly and appropriately online that allow or facilitate a face-to-face engagement. So if you have a case study that's run online where you can give context, where students could watch videos, you can have hyperlinks to different things and students can explore. It also gives students time to work in their own time, to work at their own pace and to work through the material. But it shouldn't be left there. It then should be taken into the classroom where students can break away and be facilitated through discussions, and key learning points can be brought out. And we also just discussed about what were some of the challenges working online and how, we'd have to plan to overcome those challenges, giving students a sense of what to concentrate on and how to be analytical and things like that. So the pros and cons, but I think, that's about as far as we got.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stephen. So I just, I'm going to close and then just ask Claire for a final word. But you'll see that at the bottom, I've included some resources that I've identified around case teaching that you might find interesting if you wanted to go have a look at this, which, for example, talks about different ways to present clinical cases, and then 12 tips on writing discussion cases, and so forth. And then this one, which was quite interesting, around a checklist around the characteristics for cases for small group learning. Okay, that's it from me. Claire, I don't know if you had any final closing comments.
No, it was just nothing profound or nothing really. But what did strike me when Mervyn was talking about this, well, there's two things that struck me. That one is that in the clinical cases, and particularly at the bedside, you have the real world right there, which is amazing because it puts the students right into the situation. And as you were saying, it gives them the actual practice in doing it's actual real life. Whereas in a management case, we're trying to simulate real life, and the two are never going to be completely. The one is not the same as the other, so I think that's the real life nature of a bedside case is really compelling. You would need to work a lot harder with management and non-clinical cases to make the real life nature of them as compelling. The other thing that I was thinking is that as Mervyn was talking about, understanding the holistic nature of the person. With a management case, that's also what you're wanting people to do is to look beyond just the narrow boundaries, and that the diagnostic skills are used differently, but they still need to be there to understand the problem properly, to come up with a proper solution. So there's some overlap there. But those are the things that struck me, and yeah, I found this very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Yes, Mervyn.
Thanks. I think Claire has actually hit the nail on the head. What we see with our group particularly is that their focus is on finding the problem and dealing with the problem, and they lose sight of the patient. And for me, medicine is a holistic discipline. You can't just treat the heart attack. You've got to treat the patient who has a heart attack and all the ramifications of that heart attack on that patient's life and lifestyle. And that holistic approach is unfortunately sorely lacking in the majority of clinical students. Either they are taught to from where they've originated, or they have focused on dealing with the problem because solving the problem gets them through the exam, but they don't see the whole patient. And I find this very frustrating, and I struggle with trying to get that holistic impact of the problem across to the students. Thank you.
Okay, I see Michelle's hand up, so I'll just hand over to her, and then I think I'll also just say thanks for everyone for joining, and hope you have a wonderful afternoon. But before that, Michelle, just your closing comments.
Oh, I don't know if it's closing, but thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for an interesting discussion. Just following on what Mervyn said, I obviously support what he says, but for me, it's teaching the students, which is incredibly frustrating, but also dangerous, in that they hear that the symptom might be cough, and I'm giving again an example, and they have a preformed diagnosis in their head. And what they do is then they ignore, or they make the signs and the symptoms or the history fit with whatever their preformed diagnosis is in their head, and they ignore what are telltale signs of a different diagnosis. And it's hugely risky and it's hugely dangerous. So we need to go way back, and I don't know how one fixes that. And also we need the support in the clinical setting of the facilities where the students are at. And that's really, really, really difficult to get. So they see what's being practiced, and it's problematic. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful, evening further, and see you next week. So next week, we'll actually have a practical workshop around writing a case.
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Good
Thank you.
afternoon
Thank
to
you,
you
everybody.
all.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.